Okay, good. Yeah, thank you everybody for attending the presentation. I am Brais. We will divide the presentation into parts. I will be talking during the first part, and then Andrea is going to talk the second part. So yeah, as Andrea have already mentioned, this emerged from the ExPliCit project and also from a paper that we have been written. So yeah, we hope that this presentation might be useful to deepen our understanding on the ExPliCit project and the tasks that we have to conduct in the project, and also useful for everybody that is here today. So I will start with trying to motivate a little bit the idea of the things that we are going to talk today. I think that we will not be surprised if I affirm that we are currently facing turbulent days. So I mean, only in the last year we could see unprecedented events such as extreme droughts, extraordinary storms, the beginning of a new war. So we are also aware of the situation we are facing concerning climate change, deforestation, biodiversity loss, and also massive migrations that are currently taking place around the world. So in this context, we will reflect today on the role of globalization and the current production consumption model in these social and environmental concerns. This is the idea. So in this context, we might question what is behind the products we buy, where do products really come from, which is the real impact of products. And well, we cannot avoid the fact that behind the products we consume, there is a whole network of interconnected firms that participate in the process of production. A network that is global and that configure very complex supply chains. So supply chains do really have an important role in the socio-ecological crisis that we are facing. And consequently, supply chain management is a crucial activity to address the socio-ecological crisis. Yeah, maybe the initial question that we have to answer is if sustainability is central in the supply chain management or not. Well, as we will see later on, supply chain management became a consolidated field of research during the 90s, more or less, and the question of sustainability was somehow integrated in the field since the beginning. Indeed, there were many events in the past that pushed sustainability to be integrated in supply chain management. Here we brought two recent examples. So on the left, we have this Rana Plaza that was a commercial building located in Bangladesh and which housed several garments factories. And in 2013, the building collapsed and killed more than if I don't remember, more than 1,000 people. And injured more than 2,000 people. And on the right, we have the story of Brumadinho. And Brumadinho is in Brazil. And in 2019, a dam from an iron ore mine collapsed. This was a catastrophic environmental disaster and killed more than 250 people. But the need of integrating sustainability in supply chain is not only because of this very illustrative event, but also because the current way of producing and consuming goods and services is absolutely linked to the current socio-ecological crisis that we are facing today. So here I present a timeline with the main milestones of supply chain management. As we can see, the burgeoning development of longer and complex supply chains during the globalization era moved competitiveness in the market from the focal firm to the supply chain. So this created a new need to manage and find and increase competitiveness in the market. So in the 80s, supply chain management appeared for the first time in the literature. But it was not until 90s and the first decade of the 21st century that it became a consolidated body of research. So we can present supply chain management as a field that focused on the management of flows in material, information, and capital through the supply chain, while aiming at maximizing profit and improving services. And we can differentiate between two main branches in the literature. One is focused on optimization, and the other one is focused on strategic management. So it is essential to highlight that supply chain management is tied to a particular question, which is how can firms be competitive in a globalized world that depend on a network of interconnected firms? Yeah, indeed, the field emerged from this particular need under a specific socio-technical imaginary, which is based on a global market economy system and a strong focus on technology to address social and ecological concerns. And consequently, the field evolved within this socio-technical imaginary, even when it tried to incorporate the notion of sustainability into the field. And this is precisely the main motivation underlying the discussion today. So what are we going to do today is to explore how supply chain management might look like under different socio-technical scenarios. This is, for instance, different modes of governance, different levels of democratic participation, or different emphasis on technology, for example. So our initial idea, but let's see what we can do later, was to divide this webinar in three main parts. The first one was this presentation, a second part for discussing supply chain management in different scenarios, and we wanted to create rooms and discuss these things separately, but let's see if it's better to do a whole discussion. We will decide it later. Yeah, and then the idea was to come back together to discuss all together how supply chain management look like in these different scenarios. So let's start the presentation now with the theoretical background, the theoretical lens that we are going to use to discuss supply chain management in the context of the circular economy. Well, essentially, the presentation is focused on the four scenarios presented by Brais et al. So to build these scenarios, the authors rely on two main axes, the axis of technology and the axis of governance. Crossing these two axes, they build four scenarios: a planned circularity scenario, a circular modernism scenario, a bottom-up sufficiency scenario, and a peer-to-peer circularity scenario. So yeah, we will deepen on these scenarios later. And what are we going to evaluate in these scenarios? Well, we will analyze how these variables that I am presenting now in the slide look in the different scenarios. In this presentation, Andrea and I will explain how the motivation, the political discourse, and theory building can be affected by these different socio-political scenarios. And then the idea was to discuss how these other variables could look in the scenarios. Okay, so first, in order to better understand what do we mean by motivations, political discourse, and theory building, I will present what we have detected in the literature that is currently happening concerning these variables. So let's start with the motivations. And the main question would be, what are the main motivations underlying supply chain management research in the context of the circular economy? And what we have detected is that there are four main motivations, which are, first, the increasing environmental concerns. So this motivates many scholars to research on supply chain management in the context of the circular economy. A second one is that this pushed to an increasing complexity in supply chains. So we have to learn how to manage this complexity. A third motivation is that there is a huge economic opportunity for firms in the context of the circular economy, and we can seize these opportunities. And the fourth motivations that we detected is that there is, it's necessary to adapt supply chain management to new regulatory frameworks. Good. So concerning the political discourse, the main question would be, what are the main narratives underlying supply chain management research in the context of the circular economy? And we have detected five main narratives. The first one is that technological development will solve ecological crises, that the neoliberal market is the best solution to yield an efficient allocation of resources, that decision making must be taken by experts. A fourth one is that management is oriented to compete in the market through maximizing profits and improving services. And a last one, that is that this management is a neutral activity. So there are no politics underlying the activity of management. And finally, concerning theory building, the question would be how supply chain management theory building is conducted in the context of the circular economy. And here it's crucial to differentiate between the two main branches in supply chain management, which are optimization and strategic management. So the optimization branch focus on developing and testing mathematical models to predict and optimize outcomes. While the strategic branch relies on many different approaches that go from qualitative inductive methodologies to quantitative deductive ones. Therefore, we have to say that supply chain management scholarship has engaged with many different ontological and epistemological positions, and a lot of methodologies and methods to conduct research. So this is great, actually, because the field have many tools to research supply chain management in different socio-political scenarios, which is our intention here. Good. Now we have a clear image of what already exists concerning motivations, political discourses, and theory building in supply chain management in the context of the circular economy. And now we have to see how these variables might be modified in the different scenarios. So here I will leave the floor to Andrea to explain this second part of the presentation.
Thank you, Brais. Are you happy to control the slides yourself, or shall I share my screen? Yeah. Okay, so the main idea behind this paper is to try to ask ourselves, how would supply chains look like under each of the four scenarios that Brais was talking about, that have been introduced by Thomas Bowens and colleagues in his seminal paper. Of course, I mean, as we have already talked about in a few more papers. The paper that Ben Law and I co-authored on theories of value, some of the deliverables of the Retrace project. These scenarios have many inherent limitations. We have also proposed other ways to classify futures, other way to identify them. However, for the sake of simplicity, now let's stick to these 4 initial scenarios, because it's the easiest way to start. And then, of course, I mean, in future iterations of the work we will be doing, we might articulate this further. So let's start for the first scenario, circular modernism, what essentially Thomas and his colleagues describe as business as usual circularity. This is a scenario where essentially the transition to a circular economy is supposed to be happening through market forces. So essentially governments set standards for circularity, they provide directives, legislation. There is then some level of institutional pressure for the transition towards a circular economy. However, there is no central planning effort. Essentially, governments just intervene to provide the boundaries within which markets need to operate. However, we are still completely within the boundaries of a free market capitalist economy, where essentially we can expect businesses, mainly large businesses, but also startup companies, to respond to incentives and develop circular innovations. The role of consumers is pretty much the one we see nowadays. Essentially, consumers can engage with these innovations. However, the role that wider stakeholders have in shaping these innovations is limited, in the sense that there is no participatory effort to draw on a wider pool of tacit knowledge. But we are here leveraging the tacit knowledge of economic actors in the market. This, of course, can be seen as a driver for innovation. However, there is no attempt to mobilize further stakeholders. So we can say that this approach is, in a way, quite centralized in terms of governance. Now, if we move to the next slide, we can understand what we can expect here in terms of supply chain management. And we can say that probably, under this scenario, the current assumptions for the structuring and managing of supply chains would pretty much remain unchanged, in the sense that, as Brais was discussing, we can say that, the current theories and practices for the design, optimization, and running ultimately of supply chain management would still apply. Here, we are still seeing supply chains as a competitive weapon that can be used by firms in order to achieve a competitive advantage. So we would still see, for instance, global labor arbitrage in order to achieve cost advantage. We would still see the structuring of global supply chains to gain access to critical raw materials. And still, we need to optimize the flow of materials, the flow of commodities across these supply chains. Still, we need to decide about optimal investments within these supply chains, as we are doing today. So we can say that still, under this scenario, the allocation of resources is conducted on an ex post basis. And still, probably we think that markets are the best way to achieve an optimal allocation of resources, within also a scenario where there is a lot of emphasis placed on the role of technological development as the main weapon to achieve circularity. However, technological development run in a way which is sympathetic, if you want, to the needs of big players in the market. And of course, here we can say, that the main motivations behind these setting are the quest, if you want, for resource efficiency, which is perfectly compatible with the current foundations of supply chain management as a discipline. So we could say, in a nutshell, that under this scenario, what we would see is a survival of the current way of structuring supply chains, of the current supply chain management discipline as a support weapon for achieving circularity. We can move to the next slide, which leads us to the next scenario, which is the so-called planned circularity. Now, in the paper from Thomas and friends, there is a little bit of ambiguity when describing this scenario. However, the way we have understood these also in our subsequent papers is a sort of command economy. A command economy where there is centralized government. However, here the government is not just setting regulations, setting the boundaries for the markets, is performing direct allocation of resources. So you can say we are moving from an ex post scenario where essentially resources are allocated by market forces, the invisible hand of Adam Smith, or the anarchy of production, as Karl Marx would call it, to a scenario where essentially we have an active planning from a central government through some sort of central directorate for production planning. You can imagine these a little bit like the Gosplan in the Soviet Union, with a little difference in the sense that, the Gosplan could just rely on very early computing machines. Now we have supercomputers that could technically probably solve allocation problems in a much more efficient way. So we could say that probably a centrally planned economy today would be technologically feasible. There are some authors that claim these. One problem that we could face, however, in this scenario is the fact that such a centralized economy might not be able to leverage upon the tacit knowledge, the entrepreneurial spirit of individual firms. Actually, we might not even have individual firms. We would could have a very high level of state-owned assets and firms in the economy. This might lead, as Thomas Bowens and friends characterize it, to a lower level of technological innovation. So essentially, we are here aiming at closing loop through industrial ecology mechanisms. Also, the level of participation probably within this scenario, the level of participation of citizens, of economic agents would be low, in the sense that there is a centrally planned economy, a central planning body, where essentially participation might be quite limited. And so how does this translate in terms of supply chain management. If we move to the next slide, Brais. Well, here, when we talk about resources allocation in this scenario, we are thinking about something similar to what was proposed by the British economist Paul Cockshott, who quite a long time ago, I would say 30 years ago, proposed a model of a centrally planned economy based on a labor theory of value. Clearly, in such a scenario, as also we were arguing in the paper we wrote together with Ben, a neoclassical theory of value based on willingness to pay based on price signals wouldn't apply, because there would be very limited roles for markets in such a scenario. However, there might be the scope for setting up allocation systems at the central level, which still rely heavily on optimization techniques. Actually, the development of modern optimization techniques is what makes this model, at least in theory, possible today. Of course, so we can say there will be a role for the optimization side of supply chain management. However, supply chains would play a very different role here, in the sense that supply chains will be shaped by central planning, will be shaped by the highly centralized nature of the economy, will be shaped by state-owned enterprises playing a central role in the economy. The market would be very constrained. Maybe, you know, we might have just a very limited market for final consumer goods, but clearly we cannot say that here supply chains would be competitive weapons for individual firms. So the whole side of the foundations of supply chain management as an academic discipline coming from strategic management, and so the usage of supply chains as a source of competitive advantage would probably not apply here. We would need to move towards a new theory of supply chain management, emphasizing probably more the collaborative aspects within and among different supply chains, and also talking about supply chains which might be serving the purpose of achieving system-wide objectives. So supply chains not as an end in themselves, but rather as a mean to achieve system-wide objectives. So supply chains being subject, if you want, to the power of central planning. So again, here, I mean, we are not talking about scenarios which are currently existing. We are talking about ideal types. However, we could refer these types of scenarios to historical experiences, and here what comes closer to this scenario is the experience of actually existing socialism in the 20th century, countries like the Soviet Union, for instance, where there were also some attempts to establish early industrial ecology networks. However, what we can say is that within this framework, the main driver that essentially is moving economic planning is still the quest for economic efficiency, trying to do more with less, but still probably within a growth-oriented framework. Can now move to the third scenario, which is the so-called peer-to-peer circularity, as described by Thomas in his paper. Of course, I mean, this scenario is another one which is a little bit ambiguous in a sense that it is a scenario which is open to different types of outcomes. Thomas and his friends describe this scenario as a scenario where there is a shift towards servitization, there is a shift away from ownership of goods towards collaborative consumption. There is a role played by platforms, the likes of Uber, the likes of Airbnb, the likes of Deliveroo, where essentially the aim is to optimize asset utilization. However, the source of ambiguity in this scenario comes from the fact that we might have different types of platforms. We might have market-oriented platforms, such as the ones that I've just mentioned, which in the end might even result in monopoly or oligopoly scenarios, given that they have the power to aggregate a lot of demand. There might be also democratically owned and run platforms which are essentially trying to realize the shift towards a true collaborative consumption, where also users of these platforms and workers of these platforms have a role in shaping demand and supply profiles. But nevertheless, let's stick to the original scenario provided by our friend Thomas. And we can say that certainly here we have a more decentralized approach towards the shaping of economic activity. Still, I would say market forces play a role in the allocation of resources. What does this mean in terms of supply chain management? Well, we can clearly say that this is a troublesome scenario because we have a higher socialization of production because there is a lot more of interdependence among the economic agents providing services in this context. So probably a supply chain management practice and theory which is adequate to this scenario might emphasize the collaborative aspects of the structuring of supply chains in this context. There is still a role for optimization and related techniques. However, here we are talking about a very decentralized level, which essentially needs to be enacted in order to give agency to these different actors to structure their offer. But in any case, we are talking about servitized supply chains. Think about, a shift, for instance, in the automotive industry from a model based on ownership to a model based on leasing. This is something that we have already observed in recent years. A model based on car sharing, for instance. All these can be achieved through platforms which aggregate services, match demand and supply, and so require much more interdependence among economic actors and require different tools for designing and running supply chains, which are certainly not the traditional ones that we have seen in the first scenario. So here the focus is on collaborative relationships among economic agents, something that we can find in current supply chain management theory and practice. However, a big question mark arises here in terms of the control and the ultimate outcome of these platforms. Are these for-profit platforms? Are these cooperatives? Are these platforms run, for instance, by local authorities for social purposes? Looking at these bifurcations, we might even define different types of supply chains that should support this scenario, which is probably the most problematic to us. The final scenario, probably the most preferred one by this audience when we voted for it in preparation for the workshop in Thessaloniki, is a scenario of bottom-up sufficiency, where we have completely decentralized governance, production, which is primarily aimed at satisfying local needs, surplus, which is reinvested in the local economy to improve the conditions of the local population. A scenario which is openly critical of economic growth as an objective per se, a scenario that is openly critical of economic growth at expenses of the ecosystem. So I would say a scenario that acknowledges openly the existence of planetary boundaries, of limits that can be both biophysical but also social limits. Think about, a reduced working week. Well, this might find place within this type of scenario, where essentially production is aimed at realizing sufficiency. Of course, this requires also behavioral change from consumers, from citizens. Here, the adaptation of current supply chain management theories and practices is probably more problematic. If we move to the next slide, Brais, we can briefly talk about that. Essentially, first of all, supply chains need to achieve an awareness of limits. Supply chains need to be producing goods for local sufficiency, for local social needs. The distribution activities need to be performed in order to optimize social well-being. So here, clearly, we are talking about post-growth organizations, as Mario would characterize them, which, however, in order to survive, would need to be included within post-growth supply chains. We have discussed this many times already. The supply chain dimension can be actually the valley of debt for many post-growth organizations. If you are a post-growth organization, but you're forced to rely on pro-growth suppliers and customers, can you really define yourself a post-growth organization? I don't think so. So really here, the challenge would be to revisit the role of supply chains supporting this type of objectives, but also having some mechanisms that can overcome market forces, the allocation of resources through market forces. Of course, here, given the decentralized nature of this setting, we cannot use central planning. This is a scenario where we want to have participation from local people. We want to achieve an economy of associated producers, consumers, and citizens. And so we need some participatory mechanisms for production planning, some models like the negotiated coordination model proposed by Pat Devine in 1988 could be utilized here. Clearly a very interesting scenario, however, very challenging because it would need a complete rethinking of the role of supply chains in an economy. And I think we have concluded the presentation of the 4 scenarios. Just a few conclusions, and then we can open up a discussion. So what we wanted really to highlight here in this brief presentation is the linkage between circular futures and supply chains. In each of these circular futures, we might have a different role played by supply chains. In each of these circular futures, the current assumptions by means of which we structure, we design, we optimize, we run supply chains might or might not be feasible, viable, and helpful. And we need to think within this prefiguration exercise we are running within the ExPliCit project, how supply chains could be configured within each of the proposed scenarios. This is just an initial attempt, and we run this seminar today just to open a discussion with you all who are involved in various ways in the ExPliCit project. Thank you very much, and I think we can now have questions, answers, comments. I don't know if we want to run the exercise in groups, but I think, Brais, it would be probably good to open the floor to questions now, because I'm sure there will be many. Jacopo, please.
Thank you for the presentation. Hi, everybody. Nothing, I just would like to make a comment and asking you how can you explain this fact. When Andrea was explaining the possible circular future of planet circularity, said that the historical model that was closest to this circular future scenario was, but with some limits and political and technological, of course, the real socialism experience. And you said that, for example, in this scenario of planet circularity, there are no incentive for innovation, and so we have to expect a low technical innovation. Mario? No, okay. Okay. Sorry,
Yeah, no.
I was thinking that Mario cannot hear me.
No, Mario is multitasking.
Yeah, I know. And so, but how can you explain the higher technical innovation in some sectors, not only in USSR, sorry,
yeah, forgive
or
me,
in Cuba? Yes.
Probably, I didn't explain myself well. Clearly, yeah, you're right. The experiences of actually existing socialism are the ones we can refer more closely to a planned economy, a centrally planned economy. They were centrally planned economy. And I'm not saying that we cannot have innovation in these contexts. There are also examples in what today we would call circular economy field, not only in the Soviet Union, where, we have talked about these, there were these early attempts to industrial symbiosis, but think about, the German Democratic Republic. There is literature discussing the product design in the former East Germany, where, for instance, products were designed to last longer, where, for instance, the freezers were designed to last for 30 years, where they were, developing light bulbs which could provide 3 times the amount of lighting hours. I'm not saying that innovation is not possible in that context. What I'm saying is that, it will be a different types of innovation where clearly, you cannot expect the flourishing of bottom-up ideas in a context, where you are allocating resources from the top. We cannot say, okay, we will have startups developing circular innovations. So it will be an innovation driven from the top, or I don't know if then, in this establishment, we would have workers' councils in state-owned enterprises, which would discuss the possibility of circular innovations, and this will be then feedback to the GOS plan. I don't know. I'm just saying that by the description that Thomas Bowens provided, this seems a scenario where essentially, the economic activity, the technological developments, the R&D functions are very much centralized. And so, we cannot rely on what's happening on the ground too much. The other aspect is that, within such a centralized environment, there might be very limited scope for relying on the tacit knowledge that is going on the floor. Let's say, the workers in the Dnipropetrovsk have discovered that there is a new process to save 50% of the cuttings that result from the wood processing in their factory. Probably, given the centrally planned nature of the system, there might be difficulties for this innovation to travel back in a rapid way to the equivalent of the GOS plan that needs to decide on the allocation of resources. So, we cannot expect that very quickly every furniture factory will be requesting 50% less of the materials because of the technological innovation that these people in the Dnipropetrovsk have achieved. I don't know if it is clear what I'm trying to say here. These are just very developmental thoughts, and thank you for the question, which helps us reframe it.
Thank you for the clarification.
Do you agree? I mean, what is your take on it?
No, yes, of course, I understand that there are, from one side, market incentive for innovation, and from the other side, in some context, a better form of regulation between different sector, etc. So yes, I don't have any possible, but for the incentive, you can give some incentive in other forms that are not strictly economical, as the real socialist experience did. For the other side, I don't know.
Yeah. Thank you. Other questions or remarks, please? We want to hear from you, and we want to hear mainly if this is, a complete load of bullshit, or if there is some merit in what we are thinking here. Unfortunately, we are not in a room, and you cannot throw tomatoes at us. Plus, here in the UK at the moment, there is a shortage of tomatoes, so better to save them. So, Gloria, please.
Yes, thank you very much. It is very interesting presentation. It was very enlightening for me. While you are talking, it is not a real question, just is a comment, because while you both were talking, it should to me to think what about the society to where it was the supply chain oriented. Just to link in that way, because society is changing a lot in their demands, so it could be also very but for me it was that what should to my think, the connection of that to those scenarios, to which kind of society are addressed in somehow in this changing demand of the society. Just that comment. It is a thought. Sorry. That's it.
No, thank you, Gloria. I think this is exactly the attempt we are doing here. We found this original paper from Thomas Bowens quite enlightening, because it was the first to say, well, okay, we talked about this transition towards a circular economy. However, in most of the cases we see this as something that should happen within the current economic system. There is no alternative to liberal capitalism. This is what we need to live with. It's kind of perspective like, Francis Fukuyama's end of history. Let's start also to imagine the future. As somebody would say, let's dare to invent the future. And we think, these prefiguration exercises are exactly the starting point for understanding these, and also for making more radical proposals, which, starting from these ideal types, could also help us developing some sort of proposals which might end up working in the real world. So thank you for appreciating the spirit of the presentation. Further comments? Mario.
First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. I think it really touches a lot of super relevant points and actionable points to think about the way we and the way we produce at the end of the day, right? I think a step that we can think of maybe in the future, not now, because I know that Brais is working on a paper with these ideas, is to include the dimension of change, right? Because we have a lot of prescriptive ideas, a lot of analysis of what is wrong and what needs to be changed. What is maybe missing is this dimension of how to achieve, this ideal central planning, democratic central planning, and this would include also analysis of the level of acceptance of mechanism of central planning that now at the moment are totally taboo at the European level. What kind of social subjects, movements, even why not political parties can absorb this idea and maybe partially introduce in their political programs or their thinking, their debates, and so on. Because this will catapult the debate into something that is also can have an impact on real impact on society, no?
Definitely. I mean, this would entail designing some sort of trajectories for change. So how do we get from A to B, and absolutely, yeah, you're right, Mario, identifying the subjects of the transformation, the people who should be the agents, the institutions which should drive the transformation, the movements. Absolutely, here, we are talking about, in a way, okay, put aside the eco-modernist scenario, but all the other ones include a sort of abolishing of the current state of things, as somebody would say. And so you need a real movement to achieve that.
Yes,
Okay.
if I can follow up on that, there was this very nice paper that's been published this month by Jason Hickel and others on the analysis of the real contribution to well-being of capitalism, and it's nothing that we already did, that we didn't know before. But it's striking because in a very simple way, debunks a lot of ideas that even progressive people on left have. That after all, capitalism is delivering something good, right? And actually, what they found is that the moment in which capitalism started delivering social welfare was the moment in which there was strong mobilization from basically the left. Strong mobilization in the 50s, in the 60s, with, of course, a lot of contingency and combination of factors like the reconstruction in Europe, the fact that we need people to consume stuff, so they needed to increase the consumption power of popular classes. But still, I think that's a super important point.
Yeah, most of all, probably at the time we had different competing models, and that, was driving a sort of race also to improve living standards in order to show the superiority of one of the models above the others. This is something that today is certainly missing, and it would be nice to have alternative models that also incorporate sustainability as one of the dimensions that they take as central in order to show, okay, this model works better than a capitalist free market society, and possibly, this could also drive changes in the Western world, which would be then scared about the attractiveness of this model. This is what happened, in the post-war consensus years, essentially, when you had the red threat on the one hand, and then you had, countries like Great Britain, a monarchy, the country essentially, where the capitalist economy was first developed, formalized, where liberalism was invented. Still, this country under this pressure was forced to adopt a very strong welfare state. So you can see, the merit of this reasoning. More alternative competing models saying, okay, we don't need to go Soviet style to have an NHS, to have free education for everybody, to have pensions, to have an 8-hour working day. But this was, of course, the result of a competition among models, absolutely.
Yes.
Other comments, Renato?
Yes, Andrea, first of all, let me try if the microphone is working, since when we meet with you and Mario, always have some problem with my...
Yeah, it works fine. No Donald Duck today.
Okay, I see Mario is laughing. And so just following the comments by Mario about to introduce the dimension of a change that I think is crucial in this debate, since the paper of Bowens and friends is, let's say, kind of static paper. Is providing static scenario. So our research streams invite ourselves to move towards a perspective. So my question is something that we already discussed with Andrea. I think that we should look at the future as a mix of these different future. That means not only that at the world level we will see many of these different scenarios that would be also different in different geographical and political context. And so this will provide a new scenario, a new perspective, and we should try to look at this perspective, since the world will be, of course, dependent on the policy, institutional.
Renato, we lost you, I think. You muted yourself accidentally, I think.
Okay. So, the question is, let me just repeat from this. The question is to look at a mix of different scenarios. And so we will have to look at a new scenario, a new perspective. And this is what we have to move our research streams. The scenario that is a mix of those that Bowens have proposed, and probably many other scenarios that, for example, this seminar is trying to propose. And so to move from a static to a dynamic interpretation of the future. And anyway, thank you for your presentation, for this challenging debate that is taking form right now. Thank you, Andrea and friends.
Yes, I think you're right, Renato, in saying both things. First of all, yeah, the dimension of change is absolutely crucial. And I think, this is something where we can start incorporating in this analysis soon. And on the other hand, yeah, it would certainly be possible to incorporate the possibility of multiple scenario coexisting within the same setting. I mean, it could well be, for instance, that we have planned circularity for strategic raw materials. Let's say, we have a planned circularity framework for the management of rare earths, for the management of critical commodities, and then a consumer market for non-essential goods, which is regulated according to a peer-to-peer circularity system, where we have essentially, cooperatives, democratically run platforms, providing products through servitization models. Absolutely. I think, this is a crucial comment. And I think, we need to think about this, because we need to treat, as I said, these scenarios as ideal types. However, thinking about them as sort of scenarios which are delimited by the hard boundaries wouldn't help us, because A, we could have hybrid forms, and B, as you said, yeah, we could have a setup where we do different things in different sectors of the economy with different models. Absolutely, this would be possible. I think, central planning could work well, for instance, for setting quotas, caps, for setting limits to the usage of natural resources, for assigning production targets in certain sectors. However, then once we have done this sort of indicative planning at the top level, we could let the economy run based on more participatory mechanisms, which would still allow us to exploit the dynamism of economic agents. Absolutely. I think, we need to make proposals for a viable circular economy besides, the ideal types that we can identify. So, an actually viable circular economy within our lifetime. This needs to be our objective. And now you can think I am a reformist. But yeah, I think, we need to try to make also proposals that can be viable and embraced, by political actors, by these agents of change that we were talking about. Brais, please.
Yeah, just following up the conversation, I absolutely agree with you both. And yeah, for me, yeah, there is something crucial here for me, that is that we cannot predict the final result of what we are trying to push for. So for me, the idea of this kind of exercises is try to imagine these scenarios and try to detect the desirable elements in these scenarios and try to find the actionable points for these specific elements in these scenarios. So what we will reach at the final is a mix of these individual movements that we will do in these individual elements. So yeah, this is like a little bit how I see this kind of exercise of imagining these scenarios, trying to detect the desirable elements and trying to go through that elements. But yeah, I find very hard to predict the mix of a scenario that we will reach at the final.
Okay, yeah, and if you're interested in this type of work, there is also deliverable 3.5 that was produced as part of the Retrace project, which tries to expand the scenarios typification that we were talking about. So any feedback on that would be appreciated. Any other question? Any questions about, the identification of the characteristics of supply chains within any of the 4 ideal types? Akis, you have done a lot of work on this in the past. Your blog posts in 2020 about the future of supply chains, where I would say the starting point of this analysis about the need to rethink supply chains given the current crisis we are going through. Have you got any suggestion?
I really don't know. To be honest, in this past year, we are going from crisis to crisis, and although what we wrote back in the blog post, we were talking about reshoring, etc. But to be honest, is this actually happening? Because what I see currently, and I would just take the example of cars. Okay, I don't know if anybody of you had a similar experience with me, but if you go today and order a car, Okay, a best case scenario, you are looking at 6 months to 1 year, and in most times, 50% of the in 50% of the cases, the price that you are going to pay at the end, it's open, so you don't know actually the final price. So, are we going into a reshoring scenario, or are we going into a technical crisis scenario where used cars already in the market will be used to maintain a steady level of profit, and new cars will be just like ridiculously expensive? I mean, a car that was that cost like 12,000 euros 10 years ago, the same model now costs 20. Okay, it's almost a 100% increase. So, are we talking about a reshoring, or are we talking about maintaining the status quo that was already happening in the past 10 to 20 years, and use like secondary production just to maintain profits? Because we are seeing also another trend now in the production, and I will stay in the example of cars just to be like, in the near future, I mean, it is already happening. Okay, certain categories of cars will cease to exist. So now there will be only 2 categories of cars. It will be like the city car, and then there will be like the SUV ones. Apart from that, and this is already happening with some companies such as Volvo, for instance, there will be a limit. There will be a limit in speed, there will be a limit in everything, but you can unlock it by paying a subscription. So if you buy now a Volvo, the max that you can go is 140. If you want to go more than that, you have to pay an annual subscription, I think. So,
yeah, this is part of the servitized model you were talking about, for instance, where you pay for more features for your products. Going back to the reshoring, yeah, there are indications, that this is happening. There are indications that major corporations are trying, if not to reshore, I mean, and yet there is a trend to reshore due to the rising cost of labor in China, which is comparable to Southern Europe. I mean, I was reading, a month ago, one of the main Italian chain of stores that sell clothes has now decided to stop producing in Asia and essentially, reopening a factory in Italy after a very long time. So this is happening. We're also seeing what some people call French shoring. So essentially, decoupling from China, maybe relocating facilities to India, Vietnam. This is what happens, for instance, with Dell supply chain. Dell is thinking about, moving out of China for components. The difficult thing is that, I was reading a report yesterday from the an Australian think tank. I'm copying here in the chat, which essentially, was saying that the difficulty in this is that, in the 44 sectors which can be regarded as critical sectors for the structuring of economic activity in this century, China has got a technological advantage in 37 out of 44. So, this might be challenging. Of course, the Western world is trying to decouple their production systems from China. There are elements about this. Is this good from a circular economy point of view? Again, it depends what is the unit of assessment we employ for measuring this. Because if we adopt the current targets, for instance, on emissions at a national level, reshoring might mean more carbon emissions at home, and it might not be seen as ecologically viable. While if you adopt a worldwide perspective, certainly you can say, okay, we are saving a lot of transport emissions, we are producing products closer to where they are manufacturing them, so this starts to make sense. But this highlights another crucial aspect that is missing probably in Thomas Bowen's framework, the level of international cooperation you can have in each of these scenarios. Is it possible to have a circular economy in one and only country? I don't know. I really doubt about that. And yeah, international cooperation would be a must to achieve circularity. And clearly, you know, in this scenario of wars which are being fought on the ground, with commercial wars, cold wars, we are clearly moving away from a sort of, you know, a world-wide circular economy, which could be achieved through cooperation. What we could see is another scenario where, you know, a sort of autarky inspired circular economy, self-sufficiency circular economy, by inspired by the need, you know, to be self-sufficient as a country. So a sort of, you know, eco-fascist scenario, which could well be possible, and we included it in our further typification that we developed in the deliverable 3.5 for retrace. Okay. Yes, Tommaso.
Hi everyone. Thank you for the presentation. I find it really inspiring. Yeah, especially because in supply chain management field and literature, it's very rare to have this sort of discussions. So starting from this, I was wondering whether if it's possible, maybe in this paper, to give also different definitions of supply chain management according to the different scenario, because the only definition we are taught in university courses is a definition that, let's say, has incorporated this free market idea, the fact that we need to create value for customers. So maybe also giving a different definition in the different circular future could be another idea to develop the debate.
Yeah, no, thank you, Tommaso. This is certainly a point. However, we must recall, and you know, Brais briefly touched upon this. Supply chain management was born as a field of study in the late 70s, 80s, when essentially, you know, this was needed to support the capitalist restructuring that was going on at the time. You know, we had the oil crisis of the 70s. We had a very strong labor movement in the West. We had a profitability crisis from, you know, big businesses. But if you look at the rate of profit on an aggregated basis, I mean, you know, there are calculations on these that you can consult. You could see that in the 70s, you know, the post-World War II consensus had reached an end. And so, you know, companies were looking for alternatives. At the same time, you had the great opening up in China. This created the ideal condition for the decoupling of production and consumption. Let's offshore production to the Far East. Let's have global supply chains. Prior than that, especially in Europe, but also in the US, the model was the one of the Fordist factory, where, within the Ford factory, you had even tires being manufactured within, the same industrial complex. So we didn't have supply chains at the time, at least not so complex supply chains. So I think it is perfectly normal that a field of study that was developed in order to manage, design, and optimize that phase of the capitalist restructuring in the 70s incorporates these definitions. I would be very surprised of the contrary, to be to be honest. And that's why for a very long time in supply chain management we have had a complete lack of critical scholarship. However, things are changing these days. Journals are becoming more and more open towards heterodox contributions, and definitely you're right. Looking at the purpose of supply chain management within each of these four quadrants is a must. In the eco-modernist one, supply chain management is a source of competitive advantage for companies. In the other ones, this doesn't apply. So thank you for this remark, because it has allowed us to clarify some aspect. I don't know, Brais, if you want to add something.
No, you said everything. I just wanted to thank to your comment, Tommaso, because actually it can be very interesting to make the effort to provide alternative definitions for supply chain management in these scenarios. I think that is a really good idea.
Thank you. And everybody who wants to help us, of course, as you know, the ExPliCit secondments are open to everybody. So feel free to propose something in this domain, in this discussion, and we can elaborate on it further. I think we are approaching the end of our time slot. Thank you. I think, it has been a very stimulating discussion, and certainly it will help ourselves to incorporate further elements in the paper. Renato, please.
Andrea, just following the last questions by you and Tommaso. No, the question is if we can imagine which kind of if a research system should be addressed about in the context of the relationship between supply chain definitions and innovation in definition and circular economy, is to try to find which kind of characteristics of supply chain and a circular future can match better than the others. So I think that of course there are many elements, but I think that the two let's say starting elements that probably in my opinion are also the main are the type of companies, for example, in terms of dimensions, in terms of technology adopted and the competitive context, and also the type of sectors we talk about. In this view, for example, I think that it could be very useful to adopt the model of Pavitt about the different the taxonomy of Pavitt about the different sectors, industrial firms and sector, since it just provide a first way to think about how we can match supply chains and circular future. So I don't know if they are the main elements that we should look at, but of course I think it's a very good starting point to try to analyze without going directly to move towards new definitions of supply chain and circular supply chain. Anyway, that's all.
Yeah, no, thank you, Renato. It's a great suggestion. And as I was saying earlier, the idea of looking at sectors and having also mixed circular economies where you can have sectors being arranged in some ways and other sectors being arranged in other ways could be very interesting. Yeah. And could also help us formulating a viable proposal. That is also something we should be worried about, in the sense that I love having this type of discussions and running this type of prefigurative exercises, but also to respond to what you and Mario were saying. There are probably agents of change that are waiting, for our inputs on how to do things differently, and so also, articulating this theory into a viable proposal might be very, very interesting. And yeah, thank you for the article, which I will download now. Okay, so I think we have reached the end of our slot. We want to thank you all for your participation and the great discussion that we have had. I think we have had, 50 minutes of solid discussion, which is great. It's really beyond our best expectations. And of course, as we said, this is just a starting point for the ExPliCit project. It's food for thought for the people who are involved in secondments. It's food for thought for the people who are involved in work packages. Let's keep the conversation going. As usual, the seminar will be uploaded onto our YouTube channels so that we can also disseminate that to our friends who were not able to attend. Of course, I have a little bit of a queue of videos to process at the moment, but we'll try to do this as soon as possible. Thank you very much. Have a good weekend, and talk to you soon for other activities related to our projects. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.